Canadian Pacific Airlines President Grant McConaughey wanted to be a pioneer in the jet age. Flying at 500 miles per hour, the de Havilland 106 Comet Mark I jet was 3 times faster than a DC-3. McConaughey placed the order for 2 Comets in 1949. In September 1952, Captain North Sawle, Captain Charles Pentland, and 4 other CPA pilots were selected to begin training to fly the Comet. The Comet was to be based in Sydney, Australia. The delivery flight of the first Comet, the Empress of Hawaii, was scheduled for March 2, 1953, with Captain Charles Pentland as pilot and Captain North Sawle as co-pilot, each of whom had logged more than 14,000 flying hours and over 1 million miles. McConaughey had hoped to set another speed record. The first leg of the journey was from England to Karachi, Pakistan, and the Comet performed within its expected specifications. The next leg of the trip was to be Karachi to Rangoon, Myanmar, formerly Burma. On March 3, 1953, after too few hours of rest, Sawle and Pentland were back in the cockpit at 3 in the morning, the coolest time of the day in hot, humid Pakistan. Also on board were 9 others, Canadian Pacific Airlines crew and de Havilland technicians. The Comet had nearly 2 tons of kerosene in the wing tanks. This was to be their first nighttime takeoff, fully loaded on a strange runway in an unfamiliar aircraft. Pentland pushed the throttles to takeoff position, and the Comet's 4 ghost engines sluggishly began to build RPMs. The Comet shuddered, and Pentland released the brakes. The Empress of Hawaii lurched down the runway into the darkness. No one knows exactly what happened in the cockpit, but presumably Sawle called off the airspeed readings. At 85 knots, Pentland began to pull back on the control column to rotate the nose wheel off the ground. The nose lifted too high and the Comet began to lose speed because of drag. The plane rumbled on at less than 100 knots, too slow to take off. With 1,250 yards of runway gone, Pentland must have realized his error and pushed the nose down to level the plane. It did gain speed, but there was no more runway. Pentland desperately tried to hoist the plane into the air. The front wheel hit the sand, and a wheel on the starboard side struck a culvert on the perimeter ditch. At a speed of more than 138 miles per hour, the Comet spun and shattered against the 40-foot embankment on the far side of the canal. The explosion lit up the countryside, and all on board were lost.
We were 10-year-old girls helping our mother finish up the dishes, and over the radio came the announcement that the CPA flight had crashed out of Karachi, Pakistan. And my mother went over to the radio and turned it up and listened, and then she went into the den and phoned Canadian Pacific, and we were crying. I think she dropped the dish she was washing, and we started to cry immediately. And I think within a half an hour we must have had 50 people in the house.
Relatives came in from out of town, from Edmonton, and I remember it being kind of fun because every bedroom was full of people, and we had flowers in the living room that were just pouring out of the living room, you know, enormous amount of flowers. We didn't go to school. Mother suggested that we stay home. And then I remember just playing with cousins and staying home and visiting with relatives until the day of the funeral, and then getting dressed up, properly dressed, to go to church to the funeral, which was huge.
After a brief investigation by the Pakistani government, the cause of the crash was deemed to be pilot error.
On the day that he left for New York, I had a pit in my stomach. I couldn't explain it, but I just knew something was wrong. North could tell I was terribly upset about that flight, so he sat me down and he said with a more serious look on his face than I'd ever seen, "I will never fly long flights again. This is it. I'm quitting long flights for good." After I let him off at the airport, I cried the whole way home, And that was the last time I saw my husband. My father was really not in our life a lot, but he was a hero.
Normally, when a crash occurs in a particular country, that particular country is supposed to do an official accident report. And to do that requires technical know-how on the part of the, in this case, civilian aircraft authority of that particular country. I believe during those years in Pakistan, talking about the 1953 era, they would not have had the expertise to do this kind of accident investigation. There were some design problems on the wing of the aircraft, as well as the intakes to the nacelles. What happened was that at a certain angle of rotation, instead of the air streaming back in a straight line as it was supposed to, it formed a vortex, which is actually the early part of a stalled wing. So what this meant was that on the ground, if you pulled back on the control column of a Comet 1, the aircraft could be in a stalled situation even during the ground roll.
After several other incidents caused by other design flaws, de Havilland quietly made changes to the leading edge of the wing and the engines. 6 years later, in 1959, only after members of the International Federation of Airline Pilots Association threatened to refuse to fly on March 3rd, de Havilland issued a statement reversing the earlier finding of pilot error. Pilots Charles Pentland and North Sawle were cleared. The crew of the Empress of Hawaii are buried in Karachi, where a memorial now stands. There is a marker in Athabasca Landing, Alberta, for North and his brother Leonard. And there are listings in the Book of Remembrance at the church. And 47 miles north of Slave Lake Village, the government of Alberta named a lake after North Sawle.